With everything being announced in the last few months, Ukraine getting the F-16s is a matter of when, not if. But what sort of impact can the F-16 have on the battlefield? This video will explore how might the F-16 be used tactically against Russian forces, how might the jets do in air-to-air combat, and what might they do in the air-to-ground domain, and how might they ultimately fare overall. F-16s can impact the war in the skies, but you have a chance to do that yourself in Conflict of Nations, sponsoring this video. It's a real-time grand strategy game set in the modern era. You pick a match with up to 100 other players. Each controls a real-world country. I just started another match and I play as South Africa. While they don't get the F-16s, I will get to fly Rafales and Gripens. Basically, my job is to build up my country and my army and conquer as much as I can, hopefully the world. I'll tell you more about the game after our video, but for now know that by registering a new account using my link below the video, you'll get an exclusive bonus, 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Try it and take over the world. On to the F-16s now. Our previous video on F-16s for Ukraine, released a month ago, discussed the timetable and numbers, conclusion being Ukraine will likely operate some 24 F-16s from the start of 2024, perhaps adding another dozen by the end of the year, depending on overall losses. But what will Ukraine do with those F-16s? When it receives the first batch of 24 jets, they will disperse them around the country, just like with their existing Soviet planes. Ukraine has little over 40 locations with close to 45 runways long enough to service F-16s, though when accounting for various airfields, airports and military air bases that are sufficiently far away from the front line to be useful, those figures might drop to 30-something locations. But many of those runways also have full-length taxiways, which can also be used by fighter jets. And at times, videos of Ukrainian jets operating from roads have appeared. Russian media too was known to report that Ukrainians use civilian roads as runways. While Ukraine does have fairly few highways, it's flat and many of its roads are clear of nearby obstructions. It's not implausible that there are easily over 100 locations, stretches of road wide enough and long enough to be used as runways. With airport runways and taxiways, Ukraine might have over 150 such improvised airbase spots. Also helpful is the fact the Russian recon capabilities have been shown to be very weak, with Russia basically unable and/or unwilling to risk overflying Ukraine with its aircraft, be it for strike or for recon purposes, which basically leaves only spies on the ground and a fairly small fleet of satellites to rely on. As of May 2022, Russia operated 5 to 8 satellites that might be used to provide various imagery of sufficient resolution. For example, their Canopus satellites provide too poor of a resolution for finding temporary road-based airbases. During the entire 2022, Russia launched another 7 satellites for various optical and radar imagery, but only some were large enough to provide useful resolution. Realistically, Russia might have 10 to 12 operational and useful recon satellites right now. That might be enough for a revisit time of half a day or a bit less, depending on the quality of Russian satellites. With nighttime and overcast weather blinding optical satellites, gaps between useful revisits are even worse. Then one must add image processing time, as there might be hundreds of locations just used by the Ukrainian Air Force, and literally tens of thousands of locations of interest when everything else is included. It's likely hours or days more are added. Then further hours or a day might be needed to actually organize a strike package of enough long-range missiles to hit a certain spot. Ultimately, most of the time, between a day and several days might pass between a satellite overflying Ukrainian planes and Russia getting to attack said position. So there is a very high likelihood that the Ukrainian Air Force unit would simply move, after performing several sorties from their improvised airbase. Hitting roads and runways with missiles doesn't really do much, as such craters can fairly easily be repaired within a day or so. Basically, without actual control of the skies, without Russia overflying Ukraine on daily basis constantly so it can react very quickly, Ukraine's Air Force will be able to continue playing this game of hide and seek and using its planes. That's how their Air Force survived this long. Sure, Ukraine will occasionally lose some planes, but most have been lost in actual combat near the front lines. That's why additional Su-25s and MiG-29s coming from the west were important. They kept the Ukraine's Air Force in the air, making sure they have a steady number of planes available for missions. And they will be crucial in keeping Ukraine in the air until F-16s come online. And now that most of those Soviet heritage jets that European countries once had have been transferred to Ukraine, the next logical step is to convert to a Western source of planes, ones that are much more plentiful and ones that can be supplied by the dozen for a long time to come. Hence the F-16, the most logical choice. The US has hundreds of those. Other NATO countries have dozens more left to spare. And as F-35s come online and replace the F-16s in NATO countries, even more F-16s will become available. The US might be able to even pay third-party countries and source F-16s from them, as it did with some other arms like artillery, tanks and so on. Of course, dispersing and relocating air units around Ukraine lowers their effectiveness. Sweden famously trained for such a system during the Cold War, planning to use 8 to 12 planes in a unit. Ukraine, with its smaller numbers, fewer forests to hide their planes in, an enemy that's closer by, might opt for even smaller units, of perhaps just 4 to 8 planes. Adding in time lost in relocations, it's plausible such a unit would produce only a dozen sorties every other day. Such setup will not be very effective when it comes to intercepting Russian planes in time and in sufficient numbers, but that's not been the task of Ukrainian Air Force for some time anyway. Interceptions were mostly relegated to SAM systems. So it's plausible the F-16s will simply continue a similar doctrine that was used with Ukrainian MiGs and Sukhois so far. That being said, as Soviet-sourced air defenses run out of missiles, which is probably already happening, and if the West is not supplying new air defense assets in sufficient numbers, then the Air Force might simply be pressed into doing more interception missions. And that is an area where the F-16s might actually be a bit more effective than the Su-27s and MiG-29s Ukraine used so far. The problem with those Soviet planes is that they're not as competitive in the air combat domain. Their radars are rather obsolete for today's combat, dating from the 1980s. The weapons they use are A. equally obsolete and B. often malfunctioning when fired, precisely because of their age. The R-73 infrared missiles they rely on have simple seekers, which get easily confused by today's flare decoys, which can cover a wide range of IR bands. The long-range R-27 missiles aren't any better. Their infrared variants still can't lock onto enemy planes from the frontal hemisphere at meaningfully longer ranges than the R-73. And the semi-active radar-guided variants are not competitive against fighters equipped with active radar missiles. They can be more easily spoofed by enemy jamming. They can lose lock in certain situations when the enemy is maneuvering, and the launcher plane is more exposed during the missile's flight, as it has to keep enemy planes in lock the whole time. Missiles that Ukrainian MiG-29s use are usually 2 R-27 missiles and 4 R-73s. The Su-27s usually carry 4 to 6 R-27s and 2 to 4 more R-73s, depending on whether they're also carrying jammer pods instead of a pair of R-73s. Those jammers, like all the avionics, leave a lot to be desired due to their age. They may not be very effective against the radars on Russian Su-35s and Su-30SMs. While it's not yet known which variant of F-16 Ukraine might get, and while it's entirely possible they may ultimately get several different variants, for simplicity's sake we'll go with one variant that we find most likely for starters. Old European Block 20 F-16s upgraded to MLU standard in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Most of Europe's F-16s set for retirement are of such vintage. A good deal of those planes also got some other minor upgrades in the late 2000s, where added weapons and systems, such as targeting pods, were integrated onto the planes. Later on, if the US itself starts sending its F-16s, that may include Block 50s with somewhat more potent radars. Ukraine is already using and continuously getting additional AMRAAM missiles, as it uses NASAMS air defense systems, which use exactly the same AMRAAM missiles as aircraft. While it's plausible earlier shipments were of older AMRAAM stocks like AMRAAM-B models, technologically dating from mid-90s, it is also highly likely that by now Ukraine has been getting newer variants as well. The UK, for example, declared sending its AMRAAMs to Ukraine late last year, and with UK's B model AMRAAMs being rebuilt into C5s, it's likely UK had no older model to send, so those shipments likely included precisely that model, AMRAAM C5, which dates to the beginning of 2000s. That doesn't mean Ukraine did not get or will not get even newer models, such as C7s, which date from mid-2000s. Coincidentally, it's plausible that the Russian missile tech used in their newest missile, such as R-77-1, is of comparable capability. The F-16, when configured for air interceptions, might carry up to 4 AMRAAMs and 2 Sidewinders, the latter likely of older vintage, like Sidewinder Ms. There are still sub-variants to Sidewinder Ms too, so seeker sensitivity-wise, those might be comparable to R-74s that Russia uses right now. But Sidewinders are not likely to be weapons of choice. AMRAAMs will be. Air combat, if it comes to it, will not be decided by comparing missiles or even planes one-on-one. What will happen is this: Russia might decide to start flying deeper inside Ukraine. Sometimes it will be smaller incursions with just a few planes. Other times it might be strike packages composed of 24 planes or more. Such formations would likely avoid SAM-protected zones, but not all important areas in Ukraine might enjoy such protection. If the Russian strike package is too big and too protected, Ukraine might not react at all, deciding that sending F-16s to intercept might not be worth the risk. But when, for example, Russia sends several strike planes or one recon plane, and when those are protected by just several fighter jets, then Ukraine might try their luck. Ukraine can rely on a vast network of early warning radars. They still have dozens of such Soviet-era radars left operational, and the West is slowly sending more to cover the losses. Crucially, the West keeps operating various AWACS-like planes right along Ukraine's and Belarus borders, as well as south of Crimea and Azov Sea. NATO materials state that their E-3 planes can detect low-flying targets from 250 miles away, and medium-altitude targets from 320 miles away. Actual ranges, especially considering there are even newer AWACS-like platforms being used, may well be greater. The E-3 itself has sometimes been rumored to detect air targets 370 miles away. Indeed, if one applies the 370-mile reach to a map of Ukraine at 4 crucial patrol points, one will see that almost the entire Ukraine is covered. It is of course possible that not all Russian planes would be detected from such extreme distances, but maybe some would, like the bombers or even the older Su-24 strike and recon planes, which aren't known for their low radar returns. Even detection at 300 miles away would still give a lot of warning to Ukraine, basically making Russians think twice about flying deeper into Ukraine in places other than the Donbass and Kharkiv area. Kiev might be a borderline case, but Kiev is most likely where a good deal of Ukrainian air defenses will be present. When flying high, radars on Russian jet fighters such as Su-30SM and especially Su-35 would be pretty effective against high-flying Ukrainian interceptors. Said radars are large and have passive electronically scanned arrays, which means quick scan rates. When compared to radars on 20 to 25-year-old European and US F-16s that are likely to be sent, Russian radars are quite competitive, which of course means the full range of the Russian R-77-1 missiles could be employed. Those are marketed for export as having a 68-mile range, though that figure comes without context. AMRAAM C5, when launched at medium supersonic speed and from high altitude, is likely to achieve a range of 53 to 62 miles before its speed drops to under Mach 1, according to the missile performance simulation source shown on screen. Given that Russia could also rely on the much longer-ranged R-37M on their Su-35s and MiG-31s flying behind the main Russian formation, It's not implausible the chain of events in an air battle would be the following. Both sides' fighter jets detect and track the other side with own radars, with Russia getting to fire first. Due to a number of planes, it's also likely Russia would have more missiles to fire. A steady stream of missiles to continuously pressure the F-16's pilots. In such high-altitude exchanges, Ukraine would not perform well. Even if one assumes Russian missiles would underperform and often miss, or even if the missile exchange happens at roughly the same time, the end result would likely be that Ukraine would lose most of their interceptors in such exchanges. It wouldn't matter to Ukraine if it also manages to down just as many Russian planes. Given that Russia has over 200 such capable fighter jets, and over 300 if one counts in the MiG-31, and given that Ukraine might have 24 F-16s at any one time, it would not be a sustainable way to fight for Ukraine. Once again, it's crucial to stress that Russia too can't afford to fly high like that, except in areas where they are sure Ukraine has no air defenses left. Modern SAMs are just too deadly when flying high. Alternatively, Russia could try to fly low and thus shorten the detection range of AWACS-like platforms, but we're still talking about detection from 100 miles or more. All the while, Russian planes would still expose themselves to Ukrainian air defenses, not just high-end ones, but low and medium-altitude ones as well. And crucially, they would put themselves in an unfavorable position against Ukrainian F-16s if they tried an interception. High ground or high skies can be a thing in air combat, with such planes tending to have better situational awareness, greater speed and energy to trade, and their missiles enjoying better reach. Low-flying Russians would have worse situational awareness, and the deeper they go, the more exposed they would be to flanking attacks. So if they try that, even medium-altitude F-16s on interception course, being cued by third-party radars, could approach the Russian low flyers mostly silent. They could turn on their radars only for a short while, fire their AMRAAMs, and then after half a minute more to provide mid-course corrections to their missiles, get the hell out of Dodge. The risk to F-16s in such scenarios would be fairly low, if such interceptions are done fairly deep inside Ukraine. But if done around Kiev, for example, the F-16s would then risk being attacked by patrolling Russian jets east of Ukraine. Both Su-35s and MiG-31s employ potent radars and very long-range missiles such as R-37M. Those have a likely range of anywhere from 155 to 250 miles, depending on sources, though the 250-mile figure, even if real, might not be applicable against targets such as F-16s due to their radar return and agility. Interestingly, F-16s that Ukraine will get could use the NATO-compatible data link, the Link 16. They come equipped with those, so unless they're ripped out before delivery for political purposes, NATO's AWACS-like planes could actually guide Ukrainian F-16s directly, feeding their situational awareness screens with exact enemy threats and locations in live updates. That would enable Ukrainian F-16s to keep their own radars offline more often, which would keep the F-16s somewhat more safe. Still, the Russian R-37M missile would be a real threat. British Royal United Services Institute said that back in October, Russia was firing 6 such missiles per day, and that a pair of Russian fighters was always on air patrol, equipped with said missiles. Due to their very high speed, they can be difficult to detect and evade in a timely fashion. Flying low might help F-16s to an extent, but R-37s with their large seekers were more or less built with low-flying cruise missile interceptions in mind. While actual range is likely to drop considerably against low-flying F-16s, it's still far from assured that low flyers would be safe. As with anything in war, there would be no guarantees. F-16s could be downed just like Ukrainian MiG-29s could be, or were, if they simply find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. If Russians happen to have planes on patrol nearby, F-16s might very well be shot down, which is why using F-16s to fly near the front line and do non-standoff ground strikes is not really expected as a norm. Added issue for using F-16s as interceptors is the fact a lot of planes might be needed to maintain just 4 or so planes ready to intercept at any time. Due to the need to constantly relocate bases, Ukraine would need 2 such 4-ship teams running around western Ukraine, and as there are always some planes being maintained, as well as the need for some backup planes needed for last-minute emergencies, 12 or 14 F-16s might have to be reserved at all times, just so 4 might be ready for interceptions. Given Ukraine's needs, it may prove that Ukraine will focus on ground attacks more rather than on air interceptions. AMRAAMs are nice and all, and they may lead to a few more air kills per month, but that may not be F-16's most important contribution. F-16's strong suit is really the fact it already comes with a wide plethora of systems and weapons certified for it, so over time as Ukrainian pilots get better, the F-16s are likely to use various standoff weapons. Strikes with guided bombs from standoff distances may be just as useful contribution using the F-16s. For example, they might use small diameter bombs, which are already cleared and announced for Ukraine. Those are often going to be weapons of choice. It's possible that over time Ukraine will even get the Stormbreaker as well. Those trade a bit of range for a multi-mode seeker, turning them into precise weapons even against individual moving vehicles. But that may take years, as right now the F-16 is not yet cleared to use the SAT bomb. Some 45,000 SDB bombs have been delivered to the US military so far, alongside 4 or so thousand Stormbreakers. It's plausible the US might be willing to give away and or finance several thousand such bombs throughout 2024. SDBs with their bunker busting capabilities might come in especially handy, compared to, for example, Gimler's missiles, fired from HIMARS. Another weapon of choice might be the JSO glide bomb, much heavier than the SDBs and packing a stronger punch. Their max nominal range outguns even the SDB. Unlike SDBs, which would use just satellite navigation and would be useful only against fixed targets, JSAWs also feature infrared terminal seekers for added precision and target discrimination, meaning less likely to be spoofed. Of course, none of those weapons will really be fired from such max ranges in practice, for that would require F-16s to fly at 40,000 feet, just 60 or so miles away from the front line. Doing that, F-16s would put themselves at too much risk. So much more sensible attack profiles would be flying low, then darting fast upwards and lobbing those bombs, before running back to safety. That would achieve ranges equivalent to medium altitude bomb releases, meaning 30 or so miles. It would increase F-16's chances of survival while still giving a decent reach. Doing the same with JDAMs and other SATNAV-only guided bombs would not be as efficient. JDAMs both lack range and their simple guidance leaves a lot to be desired. As Western publications reported, JDAMs and Gimlers have sometimes been lacking in accuracy due to Russian GPS signal jamming. Then there's the venerable Maverick missile. In a way, Maverick is growing obsolete, especially with Stormbreaker outdoing it in most regards. But the US still have vast stocks of those to spend. Plus, it can be a somewhat faster weapon than the Stormbreaker, somewhat harder to see on radar, so it might not be intercepted as often. There's a whole bunch of other possible weapons that the US has and might eventually come to Ukraine, like inertial navigation corrected cluster bombs. There's politics to using those, but you never know where this war will go. But the most important aspect of the F-16 is not that it is so much better than the current Ukrainian planes. It is better, but that's beside the point. Crucially, F-16 represents a switch to a type of planes that will be available to Ukraine for basically as long as there's willingness in the West to help Ukraine. Provided brand new young pilots are being trained in sufficient numbers, it all means that Ukraine will never run out of an air force, and for Russia, that means one more headache to worry about at all times. Hey, let's talk a bit more about Conflict of Nations. Know that in-game real-time is slow. I usually give out my initial orders in the morning, check up on my country a few more times during the day, and that's it. There are faster game modes available too. The base game is free, but I like to get myself a premium account. 60 days is like $10. I can usually play 3 matches in that time frame. Yeah, some games can last for a few weeks. Told you it's strategic. There's a bunch of units to research and play: airborne tanks, SAMs, attack helicopters, and many more, including nukes. but crucially, you gotta do diplomacy. Knowing who to ally with, who to woo with resource trading, that's been key in many of my games. See for yourself, give Conflict of Nations a try. Register a new account using my link below the video and you'll get that gift, 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.